So the Elden Ring DLC is coming out pretty soon, and I want to build something from the game. And I thought it only makes sense to build the strongest weapon from the most skilled damage type. The Moonlight Greatsword. Now, as of right now, there's 12 days until the DLC releases. My goal is to have this thing fully working before the DLC gets released. Even if that's 1 minute before it gets released, I don't care. That's my self goal. Now, sure, nothing happens if I pass or fail this goal, but it's what I'm setting for myself, okay? So let's do it. Now, on the internet, there's lots of different types of Moonlight Greatswords that people have made. But not one of them that I could find was able to glow with electricity. I didn't look that hard. So here's the goal. This is my Thor hammer that I made a year ago. When you pick it up, it lights up. The way that works is it uses an accelerometer that detects when it's being moved, wakes up an Arduino, which then tells it to turn on a light. Then, when you put it down, once it detects it's not being held anymore, it turns off. You can't see it, but it turned off. Just trust me. You can watch the video if you don't believe me. For this sword, I essentially want to do the exact... Holy fuck. For this sword, Now, for this sword, I want to do the exact same thing, except completely different, because I don't want that at all. I want it to be so when you pick it up, it only lights up if you do the same gesture that you have to do in the game. See, the accelerometer should be able to detect as soon as it's being lifted directly upwards, and when it does, then it'll tell the Arduino to turn on an LED strip that's built inside the blade, and should be able to make it glow nice and bright and pretty, and we should have a really nice Moonlight Greatsword. We can talk about all the electronics all we want, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if we don't have a sword to put it all in. And we can't make the sword without the 3D printing files, and the 3D printing files, well, I really cannot model very well. Thankfully, one day while doom scrolling on the toilet, I found someone on TikTok by the name of Steph's Nerdy Stuff, and she's really good at modeling, and she has modeled a bunch of swords from Elden Ring, and one of which is a Moonlight Greatsword, and she even made a whole tutorial on how to make it. So naturally, I went and picked them up and I started printing. Now, I'm pretty lucky. I have 3 printers at my disposal, so I certainly wasn't lacking in terms of printing capabilities. But man, let me tell you, there was a lot of stuff I had to print. This alone took about a week just to 3D print, and when you're on a bit of a tight schedule, it does make it a little tough. Oh, hi Coda. Nice of you to drop by. Yeah, I love you too. And unfortunately, a lot of these prints didn't work on the first try. One issue I had to solve was these files. See, off the bat, these files are fantastic, but they weren't designed to have electronics put in them. So that was something I had to go through and try to edit all the files to be able to do. Now that doesn't seem like it should be too hard. You can see the changes I did were pretty simple. I just made this internal cylinder a little bit bigger so that I could fit the electronics. And then I went and took all these internal little ice branch thingies and split them in half so I could put an LED strip down the middle. Really simple stuff, but I will say, with how many polygons are in these models, my computer's pretty good. But when I threw these into Fusion to try to just expand this little cylinder a little bit, man, did it take a while. Can I just say, whoever designed this piece clearly never expected it to be 3D printed, because trust me, when this thing comes off the 3D printer, boy, does it get some looks for all the wrong reasons. So due to the limited space that I have with this project, I'm going to be using a PCB. That way I can just design it to have all the components that fit in there and make it any size I need to be able to fit inside the handle. Unfortunately, due to the time crunch I'm on, I'm going to have to order this pretty soon. So I spent the next little bit creating my circuit and my PCB design so that I could get it made. Now, unfortunately for this project, I did do something that you really shouldn't do. I designed the PCB and the circuit before ever testing the circuit. The reason I did that is because I know how long it's going to take for this PCB to get in, and I didn't really have that time. I just figured if I thought really hard about it, I might be able to do it without making any issues. Speaking of PCBs, I want to thank PCBWay for sponsoring this video. See, imagine you wanted to build this project. You would need PCBs. PCBWay just so happens to sell really high quality PCBs for really cheap prices. But that's not all. See, imagine you need to print yourself this giant handle that totally doesn't look like anything naughty. It takes a pretty big 3D printer to do that. Well, PCBWay's got you covered, because not only can they manufacture PCBs, they can manufacture. They can do 3D printing, sheet metal fabrication, injection molding, and CNC milling. And if you're still not sold, you could even buy all your Arduinos from their module shop. You could literally get everything you need for this project in one spot. So if you're interested, check out PCBWay in the description below. So good news, the PCBs and all the components came in, which means now we can start assembly. Now this is kind of cool. The accelerometer that I chose is called a bottom terminated component. This means that the actual conductive pads are on the bottom of the component and can't really be soldered with a normal soldering iron. Thankfully, at work I have access to a machine that's able to install these types of components. See, the way it works is you place the component down, a nozzle picks it up, and then a camera is used to actually look at the bottom of the component and the top of the pad on the board. Then you line them up, and the machine accurately places it down onto that pad. The machine then starts going through what's called a reflow profile, where it slowly increases the temperature until it gets to the peak, reflowing that solder and connecting the part to the board. Then afterwards, I also have access to an X-ray machine, so I can go under and see exactly what the pads look like to see if it made a good connection. I do notice that one of the pads didn't make a great connection. I did see that this is just one of the 2 ground pads the component has, so therefore it's actually fine. The other components will have to be soldered by hand. This is one I definitely didn't want to do by hand, so I'm glad I had access to these machines. So bad news, remember when I said that you should always test your circuit before you order the PCB? And I didn't. That was a really bad idea. Well, there's a reason it's a bad idea. It's because it failed. I'm having issues. See, the problem is when I apply the power to this, the LEDs turn on, which is great. But the problem is it should be all the LEDs and they should be a different color and constantly changing, not just white, which is a problem. Now I know the reason, but I have a reason for why I did that. The reason is because I'm running it at 3.7 volts and these LEDs should be run at 5 volts with a 5 volt signal, not a 3.3 volt signal. Now I knew this going in, but the reason I did it is because I saw quite a few people online claim that they got it working with 3.3 volts without any issue. So I thought, okay, worst case scenario is maybe the LEDs are a little bit dimmer. Big deal. So I decided to go with it. And well, it would appear it's wrong. So essentially, I've spent 3 days on this already, and I've got one idea that I could do, but it's not really practical because it involves ordering a new PCB, ordering new components, and all of which will probably take about a week at least, which I no longer have. So I'm gonna just keep throwing my head at the wall till I think of something. I figured out what I'm gonna do, and it's kind of wild. So the answer is actually Star Wars. Let me explain. So in Star Wars, there's lightsabers, and in real life, people are constantly trying to make lightsabers as accurate as possible. And there's a huge market around it. I actually just so happen to have one. So this white blade actually has the exact same LED strip that I'm trying to use for my blade for the sword. Inside the hilt is all the electronics that make it work. So when you go like this, it turns on, it's got sound, and it's able to do all these different types of features running off of the same type of battery I was going to use. Now here's the thing. On AliExpress, you can actually get those electronics that control those blades. It comes with the battery, the hilt, the electronics, the speaker, everything. And as someone who's a bit of a Star Wars fan, hence the Mandalorian we got there, I actually bought a few of these electronic hilts to make a few lightsabers. Now here's the plan. I'm going to spend the rest of the time I have trying to figure out how to program this thing to make it do what I want it to do so it can still fit all the criteria. So before we can start programming, what we need to do is actually make the blade. This is pretty simple. We're just going to make it out of epoxy. So all the parts we've been printing, we're going to add silicone to those to seal them all up and pour more silicone on top of them to be able to make it into an actual mold. Then we'll make up some epoxy, pour it into the mold, and we'll add this little snowflake thingy into that. Let it dry for about 24 hours. Then we'll do the same thing with the other side. Add the epoxy in, except this time we're going to take the other half of the blade that was cured and place it on top. I used some weights to hold it down and it kind of made a connection. It wasn't great. Don't think I'd do this again in the future. Then when it was done, I took it out, sanded it all down, fixed up any imperfections, and we were good to go. All right, now for programming this thing. Turns out it's actually very simple. See, these electronics come with an SD card, and when you put in your computer, inside of there is a config file. If you open that up, there's pretty much every setting you could ever imagine that you need to change to make this thing do whatever you want. This line here lets you change the color that you want the blade to be on startup, followed by how long you want it to take to extend the blade, retract the blade, as well as all the different types of blade effects you want it to have. What's really important though is this setting. This one says stab to power on. And I think this is what we can use to be able to get it to power on and do the gesture just like in the game. And other than that, all that's left is adding in the actual sounds you want. So I went and recorded the sound of the blade turning on from the game. Then I just did a little bit of trial and error to get it to where I'm happy with, and we're pretty much set. And with hardly any time to spare, the DLC releases in 2 hours. So we cut it close. Anyway, let's go look at it. I'm gonna hit the frickin' ceiling. I didn't think that through. Oh, I'm trying to make this look heroic, but man, it's so freaking top heavy. Holy shit.